"I am not going to take care of a sick woman. Leave this house," ordered a millionaire to his wife who had cancer. Years later, he turned pale when he found out what had happened to his wife. The mansion gleamed under the afternoon sun, its white and imposing walls reflecting the wealth that John had built over the years. In the meticulously maintained garden, Mary walked among the flowers, her delicate fingers touching the colorful petals, while her light dress swayed with the breeze. She had black hair that fell in soft waves to her waist, brown skin, and deep brown eyes that shined when she smiled. John watched her from the veranda, a tall man with elegant posture, well-trimmed hair and striking features that betrayed his iron determination in business. His real estate empire had grown exponentially over the last 5 years, making him one of the most respected and feared businessmen in the market. "I'm thinking about transforming the guest room into a nursery," said Mary, turning to her husband with a hopeful smile. "Paint it yellow, perhaps, a neutral color that would work for a boy or girl." John smiled, approaching to embrace her from behind, his hands instinctively resting on his wife's still flat stomach. Their 10 years of marriage had been prosperous in all aspects except one. They had not yet managed to realize their dream of starting a family. Not for lack of trying or resources. They had consulted the best specialists, followed all recommended treatments, and prayed incessantly. John, in particular, had become almost obsessive about the subject, seeing a child not only as the fulfillment of a personal dream, but as the guarantee of the continuity of his business legacy. "Yellow is perfect, and we could put a noble wood crib in the center, with a musical mobile spinning above it," replied John, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could visualize the future he so desired. "My father always said that a man is only complete when he has a son to follow in his footsteps." Mary sighed, turning to face him. She shared the desire to be a mother, but sometimes wondered if her husband was really interested in a child or just an heir. These thoughts troubled her, but she quickly pushed them away, preferring to believe in the purity of her husband's desire. She intertwined her fingers with his and gently pulled him toward the house where the staff prepared dinner. The aroma of spices filled the air as they entered the luxuriously decorated dining room, with its shiny mahogany table and chairs upholstered in scarlet velvet. "I spoke with the doctor today, He said we're doing everything right and that we should keep trying," Mary commented, serving herself a glass of water. "He also said we should relax more, that anxiety can interfere." John frowned, a gesture he made when displeased. His competitive nature made him impatient with failures, even those completely beyond his control. In the business world, he was accustomed to overcoming obstacles with hard work, strategic intelligence, and when necessary, a calculated ruthlessness that had transformed him into a respected corporate predator. But conceiving a child defied all these tactics, placing him in a position of powerlessness that deeply irritated him. He sat at the table and began cutting the meat on his plate with precise, tense movements. "Relax, as if that would solve anything," he muttered, without raising his eyes. "Perhaps we should consider other methods, like that experimental treatment I mentioned." The following days passed in a familiar routine of work, social commitments, and those increasingly mechanical attempts to conceive a child. When their wedding anniversary approached, John surprised Mary with news of a trip to an exclusive beach, accommodation at a luxury hotel, and an entire week away from the pressures of everyday life. Her face lit up with the news, hopeful that time together in a relaxing environment might strengthen not only the chance of pregnancy, but also the emotional bonds that seemed to be wearing thin under the weight of reproductive frustration. "It will be wonderful, John, just the two of us, the sea, the sun. We can reconnect. Remember why we fell in love," said Mary, her eyes sparkling as she mentally planned which clothes to take. "Who knows, maybe we'll come back with a special surprise." The hotel was everything they had promised, and then some: spacious suites overlooking the ocean, impeccable service, restaurants with award-winning chefs, and carefully planned activities for couples. In the first few days, Mary noticed how John seemed more relaxed, his smile more frequent, his hands gentler when he touched her. They swam in the crystalline waters, walked on the white sand, and made love with a renewed passion that seemed to promise the miracle they had been waiting for. But on the morning of the 4th day, while having breakfast on the suite's terrace, Mary felt a sudden dizziness, followed by an intense chill that made her shiver despite the tropical heat. "John, I'm not feeling well," she murmured, trying to stand up only to feel the world spinning around her. "I think I'm going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The last sound she heard was John's alarmed shout as her vision darkened and her body fell unconscious onto the marble floor. When she awoke, she was in a hospital room, fluorescent lights blinding her eyes and the constant beep of cardiac monitors filling the silence. John was by her side, his face pale and tense, his restless hands fidgeting with his cell phone as he did when he was nervous or impatient. "What happened? Why am I here?" asked Mary, her voice hoarse and weak, her dry throat begging for water. "Can we go back to the hotel now?" The look John gave her had something different about it. It wasn't just concern. There was a trace of something she couldn't identify. Fear? Anger? Before he could answer, the door opened and a doctor entered, carrying a clipboard and wearing a carefully neutral expression that Mary immediately recognized as the face health professionals use when they have difficult news to deliver. The doctor pulled up a chair, sat down beside the bed and began speaking in a calm voice, explaining that they had done tests while she was unconscious, including a comprehensive tomography to understand the cause of her fainting. "Ma'am, we found something that concerns us. The tests show the presence of a tumor," said the doctor, maintaining eye contact with Mary while waiting for the information to be processed. "We need to do more tests, but preliminary evidence suggests we're dealing with cancer." Mary's world seemed to be crumbling beneath her feet. The words tumor and cancer echoed in her mind as she tried to comprehend what this meant for her life, her dreams, her future with John. Silent tears began to roll down her face as she squeezed her husband's hand, seeking strength and comfort. Beside her, John had grown even paler, his eyes fixed on the doctor, as if expecting him to reveal that it was all a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding that would be corrected at any moment. "What are the chances of cure?" asked John, his voice strangely controlled, almost cold. "And how long does the treatment take? How will this affect other health issues?" The doctor patiently explained about available treatments, surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and their possible combinations depending on the results of more detailed examinations. He talked about recovery chances, survival statistics, and expected side effects. And then, answering the unformulated question but clearly present in John's mind, the doctor addressed the issue of fertility. "Unfortunately, the treatment we will need to implement will have a significant impact on reproductive capacity," he explained gently, addressing Mary primarily. "Chemotherapy and radiation can cause damage to eggs and the reproductive system as a whole. There is a possibility, albeit small, of preserving eggs before starting treatment. But given the stage at which we found the tumor, I strongly recommend we begin treatment as soon as possible." The journey back home was silent and tense, with John driving in silence while Mary watched the landscape pass by the car window, feeling strangely disconnected from everything around her. The news of cancer was devastating on its own, but added to the likely loss of the ability to have children, it seemed like a double sentence of unhappiness. When they finally arrived at the mansion, Mary hoped to find comfort in the familiarity of her home and the support of her husband. But John was distant, spending most of his time in his office talking on the phone or working on the computer. "I need to get organized for the coming months," was his brief explanation when Mary asked why he was so absent. "Business can't stop, especially now that we'll have considerable medical expenses." The following weeks were a blur of medical appointments, painful examinations, and difficult decisions about the treatment plan. Mary tried to stay optimistic, clinging to the hope of surviving and, perhaps somehow, still fulfilling her dream of becoming a mother in the future. John, on the other hand, became emotionally more absent each day. When he was physically present, he was irritable, impatient, as if Mary's illness were a personal inconvenience rather than a shared tragedy. Conversations about the nursery completely ceased, replaced by discussions about health insurance, hospital costs, and reorganizing schedules to accommodate treatment sessions. "I'm scared, John," Mary confessed one night, after a particularly difficult chemotherapy session that had left her exhausted and nauseated. "Not just about the disease, but about what's happening to us. I feel like you're growing more and more distant." The man who stared back at her seemed almost like a stranger. His eyes were cold, distant, as if he were looking at a complicated business problem instead of his sick wife. John rose from the armchair where he was sitting, placed his whiskey glass on the coffee table with an abrupt movement, and walked to the window, where he remained looking at the garden they had once walked through together, making plans for a future that now seemed impossible. "What do you expect from me, Mary? That I pretend nothing has changed? That our plans haven't been completely destroyed?" He replied, his voice laden with a cold, calculated anger. "I invested 10 years in this marriage with the expectation of starting a family, of having an heir for everything I've built." Mary felt as if she had been slapped. It was as if all her suspicions about John's true motivations for wanting a child were being confirmed in the worst possible way. It wasn't about love or about the desire to create a life together. It was about legacy, about preserving and passing on wealth and power. Hot tears streamed down her face as she struggled to find words to confront the man who was now revealing his true nature in her moment of greatest vulnerability. "So that's it? 10 years of marriage reduced to an investment that didn't provide the expected return?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought our love was stronger than that we could face anything together." John turned around, his face a mask of calculated coldness. Years of ruthless negotiations and tough business decisions had hardened something inside him, making him capable of cutting ties without hesitation when a relationship no longer served his purposes. And now, looking at Mary, pale, thinner, with her hair beginning to fall out due to chemotherapy, he saw not the woman he had fallen in love with, but a reminder of failure, of lost dreams and frustrated expectations. "I won't take care of a sick woman who can't give me children. Get out of this house," he exclaimed, the words coming out like poison. "I don't have time to waste on someone who will only bring me expenses and sadness." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary felt as if the air had been ripped from her lungs, as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. She had imagined several difficult scenarios since the diagnosis: pain, hair loss, the possibility of not surviving. But never, not even in her darkest moments, had she considered that John would abandon her in her time of greatest need. She slowly rose from the bed where she was reclining, her weak legs threatening to give way under the weight of her body and the betrayal she had just suffered. "You can't be serious," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "We promised to stay together in sickness and in health, remember?" John merely looked at his watch, as if counting the minutes until she was out of his life. His expression was devoid of any compassion or remorse, replaced by the cold efficiency of an executive terminating an unfavorable contract. He walked to the closet, grabbed a small suitcase and threw it on the bed next to Mary, in a clear gesture of finality. "You have 1 hour to get your things and leave. I'll leave a check to cover your medical expenses for the next few months," he said, pragmatic to the end. "After that, you're on your own." With trembling hands and a broken heart, Mary began to put some clothes in the suitcase, unable to believe that 10 years of marriage were ending like this, so abruptly and without dignity. She took some photos, personal jewelry that had belonged to her mother, and the medications she needed to take daily. As she closed the suitcase, she realized how little she was taking from an entire decade shared with the man who now watched her as if she were an unwanted stranger in his home. Tears flowed freely down her face, but she refused to beg or plead. There was something liberating about finally seeing John's true character, even if the revelation came with so much pain. "One day you'll regret this, John," she said, stopping at the bedroom door. "Not for what you're losing materially, but for what this reveals about who you really are." Mary left the mansion under the light rain that was beginning to fall, as if the sky itself were crying for her. On the sidewalk, she looked one last time at the house where she had been happy, or at least believed she was. Now, with the small suitcase in one hand and the other arm protecting the womb where she would never carry John's child, she walked away, her steps uncertain but determined to find a new path amid the storm. Behind her, John slammed the door shut, the sound echoing like a period at the end of a chapter in her life that was ending in the cruelest way possible, abandoned by the man who had promised to love her forever, precisely when she needed him most. Years had passed since that rainy night. Mary's small apartment, located on the 3rd floor of a modest building, received the golden light of dusk through the only window in the living room. The space was cramped but cozy, walls painted in a soft shade of green, a few pieces of furniture chosen with care, and potted plants strategically placed to bring life to the environment. It was almost impossible to believe that this same woman, now sitting on the worn sofa, while tucking a short strand of hair behind her ear, had once lived in a luxurious mansion. Her face was thinner, with some lines of expression that didn't exist before, but her eyes, those same deep brown eyes, now shone with a determination she had never possessed in times of material wealth. Cancer had been a relentless adversary, but not as cruel as John's abandonment. "It's almost time to leave for the group," Mary said to herself, getting up with a small groan. The side effects of the treatment still made themselves felt in her bones. They need to hear that there is life beyond illness, beyond abandonment. The community center was a 15-minute walk away, in a simple red brick building. Mary adjusted the colorful scarf that partially covered her head. Her hair was beginning to grow back, but not enough to dispense with the accessory, and took a deep breath before entering the room where the support group met weekly. The chairs were arranged in a circle, some already occupied by women in different stages of treatment. Some had lost all their hair, others were visibly fragile, with skin that was too yellow or too pale. All, without exception, carried in their eyes that peculiar mixture of fear and hope that Mary knew so well. Over the months, she had become a kind of mentor for newcomers, one who proved it was possible to survive not only cancer, but also the emotional losses that frequently accompanied it. "Mary, we were waiting for you," said one of the youngest women in the group, her anxious eyes fixed on her. "Can you tell us more about how you dealt with abandonment?" "My fiancé left me yesterday, said he can't handle the pressure." Mary sat down, feeling the weight of all those expectations, of all those broken stories that somehow mirrored her own. She closed her eyes for a moment, searching for the right words, those that could offer comfort without denying the brutal reality of rejection. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, without self-pity. "Cancer revealed who John really was, just as it's revealing who the people around you really are. It's painful, yes, but it's also a filter. It separates those who love unconditionally from those who only love when it's convenient," she explained, looking at each face in the circle. "One day you'll be thankful for not spending your precious energy on those who don't deserve it." It was during one of these meetings, on a particularly difficult afternoon when Mary had received concerning results from her tests, that she first noticed the quiet man sitting in the corner of the room. Unlike the other health professionals who occasionally participated in the group, he didn't wear a white coat or carry clipboards with notes. He wore simple clothes, faded jeans and a blue long-sleeved shirt, and observed everything with attentive and compassionate eyes. His dark hair was cut short, and there was something in his countenance that conveyed an understanding that went beyond the professional, as if he knew pain not just through medical books but through personal experience. At the end of the session, as the women dispersed, he approached Mary with hesitant steps, as if afraid of invading a space that didn't belong to him. "Your testimony today touched something deep within me," he said, his soft and melodious voice contrasting with his large calloused hands of someone accustomed to physical work. "I'm Carl, volunteer nurse. I'll be accompanying the group from today on." Mary extended her hand, surprised by the comforting warmth that emanated from his firm handshake. There was something in Carl's eyes, a dark brown, almost black, that spoke of pain overcome, of battles won at a high cost. It was a look she recognized because she saw something similar every morning in the mirror. "Welcome, Carl. We always need more people who truly understand," she replied, realizing she didn't need to explain what she meant by understand. "It's not just about medical knowledge, it's about knowing what it's like to be on the other side." In the following weeks, Carl became a constant presence at the meetings, offering not only his medical expertise, but mainly his attentive and genuine listening. Mary observed how he knelt beside women in tears, how he held their hands without fear or disgust when treatment had deformed their bodies, how he remembered personal details that many professionals would consider irrelevant. The name of a dog, a favorite hobby before the illness, the ice cream flavor that still didn't cause nausea during chemotherapy. The third week of December brought an unexpected snowstorm, forcing the cancellation of many activities in the city. Only Mary and two other women managed to reach the community center for the group meeting, only to discover that the usual coordinator had also failed to attend. They were about to go back home when Carl appeared, covered in snow, his cheeks red from the cold, carrying a brown paper bag. "I thought maybe some people would make it, so I brought hot chocolate and homemade cookies," he explained, shaking the snow off his coat. "My grandmother always said there's no problem that doesn't improve at least a little bit with chocolate and good conversation." The improvised group gathered around a table, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs while the storm raged outside. With fewer participants, the conversation naturally became more intimate, more personal. It was then that Carl, for the first time, shared fragments of his own story, how he had been abandoned by his parents at 6 years old, left with an already elderly grandmother who barely had the means to support him. How at 9 years old he had been diagnosed with an aggressive type of leukemia, and how his grandmother had washed other people's clothes to pay for medications that insurance didn't cover. And mainly, how this experience had transformed him into who he was today, dedicating his life to alleviating the suffering of others who, like him, faced not only the disease, but also the abyss of loneliness that often accompanied it. "So you understand," Mary murmured, not as a question, but as recognition of a shared truth. "You know both faces of the monster, the disease and the abandonment." Carl nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made Mary look away, suddenly aware of a blush that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room or with the side effects of her medications. "Some people walk through flowery gardens all their lives and never learn to value a single petal," he responded, his words coming out soft but laden with meaning. "Others cross deserts and manage to find beauty in every drop of dew." From that day on, something subtly changed between them. Carl began to appear not only at group meetings, but also at Mary's chemotherapy sessions. He brought books to read aloud while the potent, toxic liquid dripped into her veins, a welcome distraction from the nausea and discomfort. In the weeks when she was too weak to cook, he showed up with homemade soups, his grandmother's recipes that were sworn to have healing properties. Mary tried to refuse, aware of his modest financial situation, but Carl insisted with a smile that lit up his entire face. "Don't confuse charity with compassion," he would say, carefully placing the labeled containers in the small refrigerator of the apartment. "Charity is vertical from top to bottom. Compassion is horizontal from heart to heart." March arrived with its merciless winds and hesitant promises of spring. Mary had just gone through another round of tests, and the results, although not conclusive, showed promising signs. The tumor was responding to treatment, shrinking millimeter by millimeter. A silent battle waged inside her exhausted body. It was a particularly difficult day, with intense pain due to the treatment, when Carl knocked at her door. Unlike other visits, he seemed nervous, almost anxious, carrying a package wrapped in simple paper and tied with string. "It's nothing special," he hastened to explain even before Mary could ask, placing the package in her hands. "Just something I thought might help on difficult days, when I can't be here." Inside the package was a handcrafted notebook with a soft leather cover bearing Mary's initials discreetly engraved in the lower corner. The pages were made of textured paper, some containing small watercolors of wildflowers, others with inspiring quotes written in Carl's elegant handwriting. There was also space to write, to draw, to paste photos, an invitation to document not just the journey of the disease, but also moments of unexpected beauty, of furtive joy, of stubborn hope. Mary felt hot tears running down her cheeks, an emotion she couldn't name tightening her throat. It wasn't just the gift itself, but the time and care invested in something so personalized, so attentive to her specific needs. "How did you know?" she asked, running her fingers over the pages with reverence. "How did you know that I have trouble sleeping, thinking about everything that could go wrong?" Carl smiled, that smile that slowly began at the corners of his mouth and gradually lit up his eyes, completely transforming his face. He sat down beside her on the sofa, carefully maintaining a respectful distance, although his eyes betrayed a desire for greater closeness. "I observe you," he answered simply, without a drop of shame in his voice. "Not as a doctor observes a patient, but as a person sees another person, with everything that she is, not just with what the disease has made of her." Summer brought relief in multiple forms. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about Mary's response to treatment, not a complete remission yet, but enough to reduce the frequency of chemotherapy sessions. Her hair, once long and wavy, now grew in small rebellious curls that framed her face with a new delicacy. The persistent nausea became occasional, allowing her to regain some of the lost weight. And, perhaps more significantly, mornings no longer brought that crushing feeling of despair, that brief moment of terror upon opening her eyes and remembering reality. There was another emotion now mixed with the daily struggles, a cautious anticipation, a desire to see what the day would bring, especially if it included some moments with Carl. "I'm thinking of going back to work, even if part-time," Mary commented as they walked slowly through the park, an activity that had become a weekly ritual whenever the weather allowed. "My former colleague from the architecture office said I can do small projects from home." Carl offered his arm to support her when he noticed she was breathing more heavily after the small incline. There was a gentleness in his gestures of help that never made Mary feel invalid or dependent, just cared for, just valued in her momentary vulnerability. "I think it's an excellent idea if you feel ready," he replied, his tone carefully neutral without pressure in either direction. "Just promise you'll respect your limits and not try to prove anything to anyone." It was during one of these walks, when autumn was beginning to paint the trees with shades of red and gold, that Carl finally found the courage to speak about what was growing between them. They had stopped to rest on a wooden bench overlooking the small lake, watching ducks gliding serenely across the water. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that only exists between people who don't feel the need to fill it with empty words. Mary had her eyes closed, face turned toward the warm late afternoon sun, when she felt Carl's hesitant fingers seeking hers in the space between them on the bench. "I'm afraid I'm confusing things," he began, his voice trembling slightly, revealing a vulnerability he rarely let show, of misinterpreting what exists between us, of crossing a line I shouldn't. Mary opened her eyes, turning to face him. In the golden light of dusk, Carl's face looked different, younger, more exposed, stripped of the professional confidence that typically characterized him. There was something infinitely precious in this vulnerability, in this courage to risk rejection to seek truth. For a moment, Mary felt afraid too, though for different reasons. Afraid of not being able to love again, of being too damaged, of eventually disappointing him, or worse, being abandoned again when she needed it most. But beneath this fear, like an underground current, flowed something stronger, something that had grown silently during months of genuine companionship, mutual respect, shared understanding. "I'm not confusing anything," Mary replied, her voice firmer than she expected. "I am scared, yes, but not confused. What I feel for you is the clearest thing in a life that has become so uncertain." The transformation on Carl's face was almost comical, relief, joy, and disbelief, mixed in an expression so open, so sincere, that Mary couldn't help a small laugh. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it with reverence, as if it was something infinitely precious. He didn't try to kiss her on the lips that day, respecting the invisible boundaries she still needed, giving time for trust to grow at the same pace as affection. It was so different from the impetuous passion she had lived with John, one that had burned intensely only to extinguish at the first real adversity. What was growing between her and Carl had deeper roots, nourished by common ground of survival, of understanding human frailties, of valuing the small acts of kindness in a world that often seemed designed to break hearts. "I don't promise to be perfect," said Carl, his eyes fixed on hers with almost painful intensity. "But I promise to never use your vulnerabilities against you, never turn your fears into weapons, never abandon when the path gets difficult." The following months brought a series of firsts. The first hesitant kiss under the doorway of Mary's apartment, Carl's hands gently framing her face, as if it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. The first time he cooked for her in his own apartment, even smaller than hers, but welcoming in its organized simplicity. The first night they spent together, just sleeping embraced, when a winter storm caused a blackout in the neighborhood, and Mary's fear of being alone in the dark overcame her hesitation to take this step. And in each of these firsts, Carl demonstrated the same infinite patience, the same respect for her boundaries, the same silent gratitude for each small barrier she allowed him to cross. There was no rush, no rigid expectations, just two people damaged by life finding in each other safe space to heal old wounds. "Sometimes I think cancer was a disguised gift," Mary commented one night, nestled against Carl's chest as they watched the stars from the small balcony of her apartment. "If it weren't for it, I would still be living a lie with a man who only loved me while I served his purposes." Carl caressed her hair, now long enough to form small curls that framed her face in a way he found absolutely adorable. There was a solemnity in his expression when he answered, as if weighing each word. "Pain is rarely the gift itself, but sometimes it's the path to something we couldn't find otherwise," he reflected, his deep voice mixing with the distant sound of traffic. "Like a map written in code that we can only decipher by passing through the darkest valley." When the doctor finally pronounced the word remission, after another complete cycle of exams, Mary cried in Carl's arms for almost an hour. They weren't just tears of relief, although that feeling was certainly present. They were tears of gratitude for the second chance, not just to live, but to live authentically, valuing what really mattered. They were tears for the time lost seeking validation in the wrong things, the wrong people. And they were, perhaps most significantly, tears of amazement at the unexpected way life had offered her redemption. Through the very disease that had almost killed her, through the abandonment that had almost broken her, she had found her way to a truer love than she had ever known. "And now?" Carl asked that night, as they celebrated the news with a small party in Mary's living room. Just the two of them, and a bottle of non-alcoholic wine. "What's the next chapter in Mary's story?" She smiled, that full smile that had disappeared for so long and now returned with increasing frequency. There was a quiet confidence in her movements when she stood up and extended her hand to Carl, inviting him to a slow dance to the soft music coming from the small radio in the corner of the room. Her body was different. Scars where once there was only smooth skin, more prominent bones, a fragility that might never completely disappear. But there was also a new strength, a resilience that went beyond the physical, a beauty that had nothing to do with the superficial standards that had concerned her before. In Carl's arms, moving slowly across the small living room, Mary finally felt she had found her place in the world, not in the grand and luxurious spaces of her previous life, but in this small apartment, with this man who loved her not despite her scars, but with them, through them, because of them. "The next chapter," she answered, resting her head on his shoulder, "is still being written. But for the first time, I'm not afraid to turn the page." John's mansion seemed to grow a little larger each day, its empty spaces echoing with a silence that no amount of ambient music could fully fill. Years had passed since he had expelled Mary from his life, and although his fortune had doubled during this period, the result of aggressive investments and strategic acquisitions of struggling companies, something indefinable seemed to be missing. The white walls, once elegant, now appeared sterile. The expensive furniture cold, the artwork acquired at exclusive auctions empty of meaning. John walked through the rooms like a ghost in his own castle, watching the sunset through the enormous windows that offered a privileged view of the city. Not even the occasional company of stunning women, models, actresses, socialites, could dispel that persistent feeling that something essential was missing. They all eventually left, disheartened by the coldness that had permanently settled in his heart, by his inability to offer anything beyond expensive gifts and nights at exclusive restaurants. "Sometimes I wonder if it was a mistake," John muttered to his reflection in the mirror while adjusting his Italian silk tie. "But she was dying and I needed someone who could give me a child, not a burden." Breakfast was served on the veranda, as on all mornings when the weather permitted. The immaculately arranged table seemed absurdly large for a solitary man, but John insisted on maintaining certain traditions, certain standards, as if formality could compensate for the absence of genuine human connection. The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman who rarely spoke beyond what was strictly necessary, placed the newspaper and some magazines next to his plate, as she always did. John barely paid attention to the food as he listlessly flipped through the publications, more out of habit than genuine interest. It was then that his eyes fell upon a small note in the social section of a local magazine, accompanied by a photograph that made his heart skip a beat. The title was simple: "Charity event raises funds for oncology treatment center." But it wasn't the title that caught his attention. It was the familiar face in one of the photos illustrating the article. "Mary," he whispered, a mixture of surprise and something akin to nostalgia tightening his chest. There she was, smiling at the camera, her hair much shorter than he remembered, but undeniably her. She looked thinner, with more pronounced features, but there was a luminosity in her face that strongly contrasted with the last image he had of her. Pale, fragile, devastated. Beside her stood a man whom John did not immediately recognize. He wasn't anyone from the social circle they had frequented together. This man had a simple appearance, with a genuine smile and an arm protectively placed around her shoulders. John brought the magazine closer to his eyes, reading the caption in small letters. Architect Mary, cancer survivor, accompanied by her boyfriend Carl, volunteer nurse at the support center where they met. The information caused an inexplicable discomfort in John, a strange sensation that he quickly tried to rationalize as mere curiosity about the fate of someone who had been part of his life. "She always had bad taste," he muttered to himself, tossing the magazine aside with a gesture that was meant to be casual, but carried poorly disguised irritation. She must be with him out of convenience. A nurse? She probably needs someone to take care of her while she remains sick. Try as he might, John couldn't forget the image for the rest of the day. In important meetings, while executives presented reports and projections, his mind repeatedly returned to that smile, that apparent happiness that Mary displayed alongside a man who certainly couldn't offer even a fraction of the material comfort he had provided. There was something deeply disturbing about the idea that she might be well, happy even, without him, especially with someone so obviously inferior in terms of status and resources. During dinner, alone in the immense dining room, John found himself imagining what her life might be like now. Where did she live? Under what conditions? How did she pay for treatment without his money? The idea of Mary living in a small apartment, depending on the charity of a poorly paid nurse, should have brought him a sense of superiority, validation for his decision. Instead, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "She'll realize the mistake she made," he said aloud, as if trying to convince the silent walls. "When the money runs out and reality sets in, she'll regret not accepting my help when I offered it." The following weeks brought an apparently normal routine. John immersed himself even more deeply in work, as if the growing numbers in his bank accounts could somehow fill the emptiness that seemed to be growing inside him. He acquired another luxury property, bought a limited edition sports car, made donations to carefully selected charities that would ensure honorable mentions and plaques with his name. All these actions seemed increasingly empty, devoid of any real satisfaction. On the rare occasions when he allowed himself to think about it, John told himself it was just a phase, that he would eventually find a suitable woman, young and healthy, with whom he could have the child he always wanted. But even that prospect had lost some of its luster. At night, in his dreams, he often saw Mary's face, not as it was in the recent photo, but as she was in the early years of marriage, full of life and possibilities, looking at him as if he were the most important person in the world. "I can't be stuck in the past," he said firmly to his reflection, as he prepared for yet another social event that didn't really interest him. She made her choice and I made mine. Life goes on. The coincidence, if one can call it that, occurred on a Friday night, 4 months after John had seen that photo in the magazine. He had scheduled a business dinner at the Star Restaurant, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, known for its months-long waiting list and its strict privacy policy that attracted celebrities and magnates seeking discretion. The place was the very definition of luxury, with soft lighting, elegant furniture, and impeccable service that anticipated wishes before they were even expressed. John arrived early, as was his custom, always preferring to be the first to any appointment, a small habit of control he maintained in all aspects of his life. The maitre d' led him to a privileged table, situated in a corner that offered both privacy and a clear view of the rest of the environment. John ordered an aged whiskey, appreciating the weight of the crystal in his hand while waiting for his guest, a potential investor from another country. "Sir, your guest just called. Unfortunately, he will need to cancel the meeting due to an unforeseen issue with his flight," informed the maitre d', approaching discreetly. "He sends 1,000 apologies and suggested rescheduling for lunch tomorrow." John nodded, hiding his annoyance behind a mask of indifference cultivated over years of negotiations. He considered leaving. The prospect of dining alone wasn't particularly attractive, even in a place like this. But something made him stay, perhaps the reluctance to return to the empty mansion earlier than planned. He ordered the menu and was considering the options when his gaze was drawn to movement at the restaurant entrance. A woman was entering, accompanied by a man. There was something familiar about her, in the way she moved, in the tilt of her head when she smiled. John felt his heart accelerate before his brain fully processed the information. It was Mary, no doubt about it. Even with the distance, even with the change in her appearance, he would recognize her anywhere. "It's not possible," he muttered, his body tensing involuntarily. "Of all places, right here, right today." John observed with a mixture of fascination and discomfort as the couple was led to a table on the other side of the restaurant. The man beside her was the same from the photo, the nurse, dressed in what appeared to be his best suit. Well cut, but clearly not designer. Still, there was dignity in his posture, a quiet confidence in the way he pulled out the chair for Mary before sitting down. And then, when she turned slightly to thank the waiter who handed them the menus, John saw what his brain initially refused to process. Mary's elegant but simple dress outlined an unmistakable curve in her belly. She was pregnant. Undeniably pregnant. Not in the early stages, but with a prominent belly, probably in the advanced second trimester. The shock was so great that John almost dropped his glass, the amber liquid dangerously oscillating near the edge. "Impossible," he whispered to himself, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes clearly saw. The doctors said she couldn't. The scene before him seemed surreal, as if he were observing an alternative reality where his worst insecurities took shape. Mary had not only survived, she was radiant. The cancer that should have consumed her seemed to have left no visible marks beyond a maturity in her features that only made her more beautiful. Her hair, though shorter than it used to be, now framed her face in healthy curls. Her skin had that characteristic pregnancy glow, and there was a serenity in her expression that John couldn't remember seeing before. But most disturbing of all was the way she looked at the man in front of her, with a mixture of admiration, complicity, and love that made John's stomach painfully contract. It was a look he knew well, as she used to direct it at him in the early years of their marriage, before the obsession for an heir began to erode their relationship. How did he achieve what I, with all my resources, could not? Thought John, a bitter taste of bile rising in his throat. What does this man have that I don't? John observed, paralyzed, as the couple chatted animatedly, their hands occasionally meeting over the table in gestures of casual affection. At one point, he saw Mary taking the man's hand to her belly, as if sharing some movement of the baby. The smile that illuminated the nurse's face at that moment was so genuine, so full of wonder and gratitude, that John had to look away, feeling strangely like an intruder witnessing something sacred. Memories flooded his mind, he and Mary discussing fertility treatments, consultations with specialists, the growing frustration with each failed attempt, the way he gradually began to blame her, as if her inability to get pregnant was a personal failure, a breach of contract in their matrimonial transaction. And now there she was carrying a child, not his but of a man who probably didn't have even a fraction of his wealth. "Sir, is everything all right?" asked the waiter, approaching discreetly upon noticing the paleness in his face. "Can I bring you anything else?" The sound called John's attention back to reality. He realized he had been holding his breath, that his hands were slightly trembling, that a cold sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. He needed to leave before being seen. The idea of a confrontation, of having to look into Mary's eyes after everything he had done, was unbearable. But his legs seemed made of lead, refusing to obey. Something primitive inside him, a toxic combination of wounded pride, envy, and a disturbing feeling he refused to recognize as regret, kept him fixed to the chair, unable to take his eyes off the scene that represented everything he had lost. "I'm fine," he finally responded, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. "Bring the check, please. I need to go." While waiting, John continued observing the couple. Each shared laugh, each exchanged glance like a small stab to his ego. It was then that he saw Mary raise her eyes, her gaze sweeping the restaurant in a casual movement until it stopped abruptly. Their eyes met across the space filled with tables, people, and years of separation. For an instant that seemed to freeze time, John saw a series of emotions cross her face. Surprise, recognition, perhaps a brief flash of something like sadness or nostalgia. But there was no anger, no resentment, none of the bitterness he would expect from someone who had been abandoned in their most vulnerable moments. Instead, after the initial shock, what remained in her expression was something much harder to bear, a kind of understanding pity, as if she could see through him to the emptiness his existence had become. "Mary," he murmured, the name escaping his lips like an involuntary prayer. John couldn't tell how long that eye contact lasted, seconds perhaps, though it seemed much longer. It was interrupted when the nurse, noticing the change in Mary's expression, followed her gaze. There was a moment of confusion on his face, followed by a flash of recognition when Mary probably whispered an explanation. The man showed no hostility or aggression, as John would have expected. Instead, after a moment of hesitation, he did something completely unexpected. He briefly nodded to John, an almost respectful gesture, before turning his attention back to Mary, placing a protective but not possessive hand over hers. It was as if he recognized the role John had played in her life without allowing it to diminish in any way the present they shared. "Sir, your check," said the waiter, interrupting the moment with professional discretion. John signed the receipt mechanically, leaving an absurdly generous tip, an automatic gesture that required no conscious thought. He stood up like a man in a trance, his legs now suddenly eager to take him away from there, out of that space that seemed to have drastically shrunk. As he walked toward the exit, he made a conscious effort not to look in Mary's direction again, although he could feel her eyes following him. The cool night air hit his face like a slap, bringing painful clarity. His driver, waiting on the sidewalk, hurried to open the car door, but John gestured dismissively. "I'll walk for a bit," he said, his voice rough. "Go back to the mansion. I'll call when I need you." The streets of the elegant neighborhood were partially empty at that hour, allowing John to walk without the constant irritation of bumping into other people. The night was pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the distant scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. On any other occasion, he would have appreciated the exclusive environment, proud to be part of the select group that could afford to frequent that area of the city. Now, however, he barely noticed the luxury establishments, the elegant facades, the imported cars parked along the sidewalk. His mind was filled with images that cruelly overlapped. Mary in her wedding dress on their wedding day. Mary pale and frightened, receiving her cancer diagnosis. Mary leaving his house with just a small suitcase, abandoned when she needed support the most. And finally, Mary pregnant, radiant, looking at another man as if he were her entire world. "How is this possible?" he asked aloud, startling an elegant woman passing in the opposite direction. The doctors guaranteed she could never get pregnant after the treatment. The answer came in a voice that seemed strangely similar to his father's, a hard man who had built an empire from nothing and who frequently despised what he called his son's useless sentimentalism. "Maybe the problem was never her, maybe the problem was always you." John stopped abruptly, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. They had never seriously considered that possibility. All the tests, all the treatments, all the consultations with specialists had started from the assumption that Mary was the problem to be fixed, and he, in his arrogance, never questioned that assumption. It was easier, more comfortable for his ego to believe that the flaw was in her. Or perhaps, the relentless voice in his mind continued, it's something even simpler. Perhaps it's the power of true, unconditional love, the kind of love you were never capable of offering. John laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the empty streets like the cry of a wounded animal. True love. What sentimental nonsense! The world operated on transactions, on exchanges of value, on investments calculated to maximize returns. That's how he had built his empire. That's how he had approached his marriage. Mary was an asset that, when it stopped offering the expected return, an heir to his fortune was discarded like a failed investment. And now life was showing him with cruel irony that he had made the most basic mistake of any investor. He had incorrectly evaluated the asset, had given up too soon, had lost the opportunity for his greatest return. I would have given her everything, he murmured into the night, his voice breaking. Everything money can buy. And perhaps that was exactly the problem, John realized, as he slowly returned to where his driver was waiting, resigned to go back to his empty mansion, to his life of material achievements, empty of meaning. He had offered Mary everything money could buy, but apparently the nurse had offered something that no amount of money ever could. Presence in difficult moments, support without expectations, love that didn't depend on her usefulness or reproductive capacity. And ironically, that emotional investment had resulted in exactly the return that John most coveted: a child, a continuity, a future. As he got into the car, John felt a lump in his throat and an unusual moisture in his eyes that he refused to recognize as tears. "Home, sir?" asked the driver, looking at him in the rearview mirror. John nodded silently, unable to trust his voice. As the car glided through the illuminated streets of the city, he observed the people on the sidewalks, couples holding hands, families with children, groups of friends laughing, and felt more distant from them than ever. The mansion that awaited him, with its empty rooms and oppressive silence, wasn't really a home. It was just a physical space filled with expensive objects, as empty of meaning as his own existence had become. "What have I done?" whispered John, the words so low that not even he was sure he had said them aloud. "My God, what have I done?" Spring had arrived in full force, bringing with it an explosion of life that seemed to reflect the moment that Mary and Carl were living. The small apartment was now filled with the occasional crying and soft coos of Michael, their newborn son. The birth occurred without complications, another miracle in a story already full of them. The baby was born with dark hair and the same intense eyes as his mother. Carl had cried when holding him for the first time, a silent cry that made Mary fall even more in love with the man who stayed by her side. "He has your eyes," whispered Carl, caressing his son's little face, "and your strength too. Look how he grips my finger, as if he already knows exactly what he wants in life." Days turned into weeks, establishing a new routine that brought a fullness neither had experienced before. The handcrafted crib that Carl had built occupied a privileged corner of the living room, near the window, where morning light created dancing patterns. Photos of little Michael began to fill the walls, documenting each sleepy smile, each significant moment. "I never thought I could love someone like this so instantly," Mary confessed while rocking the baby. "It's as if he had always been a part of me." That Sunday morning, Mary was cradling Michael, who slept in her arms, when the doorbell rang. Carl, surprised, opened the door and found John in the hallway, impeccably dressed and holding an enormous bouquet of exotic flowers. A tense silence settled, the two men studying each other, recognizing one another without ever having been introduced. "You must be Carl," John finally said. "I need to speak with Mary, please." Carl hesitated, but before he could decide, he heard Mary's voice behind him. "It's okay, let him in," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I think it's time we close this chapter once and for all." John entered, his eyes observing the surroundings until they settled on Mary with the baby in her arms, an image that made him stop abruptly. He had imagined this moment, but now, confronted with reality, all the prepared words seemed inadequate. "Mary, he began, extending the bouquet. "You look beautiful." Mary accepted the flowers with a nod, handing them to Carl, who placed them in a simple vase. John approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in her arms. "May I?" he asked, indicating the sofa beside her. With a gesture of agreement, he sat down, maintaining a respectful distance. His gaze couldn't move away from the baby, and something in his face seemed to slowly crumble. "Mary, I made the biggest mistake of my life," said John, his voice more sincere than she had ever heard it. "I've been thinking about you every day since I saw you in the restaurant. I can't forget how happy you looked." Mary observed the man who had once been her world, noticing the changes time had imprinted on him. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were observing a scene about someone else's life. "I want you to come back to me," John continued, leaning forward. "Don't marry this man. He's poor and won't be able to take care of you and the child like I can. I can give you both a life he could never offer." Carl, who was watching from the kitchen, visibly tensed, but kept his silent promise to give Mary the space she needed. His eyes briefly met hers, conveying confidence and support. Mary repositioned the baby in her arms, revealing his little face more clearly to John. "John, when I needed you most, you sent me away," she responded with surprising calmness. "You chose not to be part of my pain, so you have no right to want to be part of my joy now." The baby stirred, briefly opening his eyes before falling back asleep, confident in his mother's arms. "Carl welcomed me when I was most vulnerable and saw beauty in me when I couldn't see it myself," she continued, looking at the man in the kitchen. "He held my hand during every chemotherapy session, dried my tears when I was too scared to sleep." John tried to speak, but Mary gently raised her hand, asking him to let her finish. "With love, everything is possible. Miracles happen when you truly love," she said, "without anger or bitterness, just a quiet conviction. And the one who showed he wasn't able to care was you, not Carl. Money isn't everything in life. True value lies in who stays by our side in difficult moments." A dense silence followed. John seemed physically struck by her words, his face pale. His eyes now reflected the painful understanding of someone who finally grasps the true cost of their choices. "I understand," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "I think I always knew it would be this way since I saw you in the restaurant. I just needed to try." He rose slowly, like a much older man, the weight of defeat visible in his shoulders. At the door, he stopped to look one last time at Mary and the baby. "He is beautiful," said John with unexpected sincerity. "You deserve to be happy." And he left, softly closing the door. Carl sat down next to Mary, gently embracing her, respecting the emotions she was certainly feeling. "Are you okay?" he finally asked. Mary nodded, surprised by the truth of that statement. The encounter with John had closed a cycle, allowing her to release the last traces of pain she still carried. Months passed. On a sunny afternoon, Mary and Carl were in the small garden of the building. Michael, now almost a year old, was taking his first hesitant steps under the watchful eyes of his parents. Carl had brought a small cake to celebrate their dating anniversary. Life wasn't luxurious, but there was a richness that no bank account could measure. "Sometimes I wonder if he found peace," commented Mary, watching Michael trying to reach a butterfly. "I hope so," replied Carl, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Everyone deserves to find their path to happiness." Meanwhile, miles away, John was watching the sunset from his lonely mansion. The walls displayed his professional successes, but there were no signs of human connection. Recently, he had anonymously donated to a new oncology wing dedicated to young women with cancer. "I understood too late what really matters," he murmured, as the last ray of sunlight disappeared, leaving him in the shadows. Years passed. The small apartment that once housed so many moments of joy and overcoming was left behind, replaced by a modest house on the outskirts of the city. It had a larger garden where Michael, now 6 years old, could run freely, and a small veranda where Mary designed her architectural projects. Her name had gained recognition in the market, specializing in accessible spaces for people with special needs, a passion born from her own experience as a patient. Carl continued as a nurse, but now coordinated the volunteer program at the oncology center, training people to offer the same support that he once provided to Mary. On weekends, he taught carpentry to underprivileged children, teaching them to build small objects with their own hands. His philosophy was simple. Creating something from nothing was a way to believe in possibilities, even when everything seemed impossible. Little Sarah, the couple's second child, just 2 years old, completed the family. Born without complications, she was living proof that doctors don't always have all the answers, that there are miracles science still cannot explain. On the 4th anniversary of the Oncology Center, Mary was invited to be the keynote speaker. In the packed auditorium, she shared her journey without bitterness or resentment, focusing only on the importance of emotional support during treatment. At the end of her speech, she publicly thanked the anonymous person who had funded the new wing of the hospital, allowing more women to have access to advanced treatments. In the last row, discreetly, John observed. Hair completely grey now, deep lines marking a face that had learned difficult lessons. He didn't come to be recognized or forgiven, just to witness the good that had indirectly been born from his misguided choices. He had found purpose in funding cancer research, becoming one of the country's largest private donors. It didn't fill the emptiness in his life, but it offered some comfort. When everyone stood up to applaud Mary, John saw Carl approach the stage with Michael and Sarah. The family hugged, an image of genuine love that made him smile melancholically. He left before they could notice him, leaving behind only an envelope at the reception desk, addressed to Mary, containing the deed to a plot of land for building a support house for families of cancer patients. That night, as she put her children to bed, Mary felt a strange sensation of coming full circle. From her greatest pain was born her greatest joy. From abandonment she had found belonging, from rejection unconditional acceptance. "Mom, are you happy?" asked Michael sleepily as she adjusted his blanket. "Very," replied Mary, kissing his forehead. "Because I learned that true happiness isn't in the things we have, but in the people we love and the good we do." Carl watched from the door, his heart overflowing as he contemplated the family they had built together, not with bricks and mortar, but with compassion, courage, and an unwavering faith in the human capacity to rise from one's own ashes. Did you like Mary and Carl's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.